She had spent 2 years in silence. 2 years setting a coffee cup she never filled. 2 years learning what loneliness does to a person, what it quietly opens inside you, what it makes you willing to believe. When the letters started arriving, she told herself it was charity. By the third month, she wasn't telling herself anything. She was just waiting for the mail. He was charming. He was careful. He knew every detail of her grief because she'd given it to him word by word in her own handwriting. And by the time she finally typed his name into a search bar and hit enter, she understood that she hadn't found him at all. He had found her. And he had been looking for a very long time. By November, they were writing twice a week. Maggie had cleared a small drawer in Frank's old nightstand. She'd needed 2 glasses of wine to open that drawer, and another 15 minutes sitting on the floor afterward, and that was where she kept Robert's letters. She'd rubber-banded them by month. October held 4 letters. November was growing. He wrote beautifully. That was the first thing she'd noticed, and the thing that continued to disarm her. Not poetically, nothing flowery or performative, but with a kind of careful honesty that felt rare. He wrote about the difficulty of silence in a place that was never truly quiet. He wrote about a mockingbird that returned to the yard outside the recreation area every spring, and how he'd spent one entire afternoon listening to it cycle through its repertoire of stolen songs. He wrote about his mother, who had died while he was incarcerated and whom he hadn't been permitted to attend the funeral of, Anne, how that grief had settled into him like something permanent. "I've made decisions I can't unmake," he wrote in one letter, the ink slightly uneven, as though he'd pressed harder than usual. "But I've stopped pretending the decisions weren't mine to make. That's the closest thing to peace I've found in here." Maggie read that paragraph 4 times. Then she wrote back about Frank, about losing him, about the scrambled eggs, about the second coffee cup she still set out every morning, about the particular cruelty of a grief that had no warning, no preparation, no chance to say the things that needed saying. It was the most honestly she'd spoken about Frank's death to anyone, including Patty, including her book club friends, including Father McCarthy. She told Robert things she hadn't told anyone. She understood, somewhere in the rational part of her mind, that this was what made it dangerous. Intimacy built on words alone, on selected words, carefully composed, with time to revise before sending, was a particular kind of intimacy. It was the most curated version of a person. But she told herself that honesty was honesty, regardless of the medium, and that what she felt reading his letters was connection, real and tangible, and she hadn't felt that in a very long time. By December, he was calling her Maggie. By January, she was counting the days between letters. It was Patty who noticed first. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon in mid-January with a pot of her chicken and dumpling soup and found Maggie at the kitchen table, writing. Not unusual in itself. Maggie had always been a letter writer, had kept up correspondence with her college roommate for decades, but something about her mother's posture, the particular way she curved over the page, made Patty set the soup down slowly and say, very carefully, "Who are you writing to?" Maggie told her. The silence that followed lasted approximately 8 seconds and felt considerably longer. "Mom." Patty pulled out the chair across the table and sat down with the deliberate movements of someone choosing their words as precisely as a surgeon choosing instruments. "How long has this been going on?" "It's a church program, Patty. It's supervised correspondence." "There's nothing. How long?" "Since October." Patty pressed her lips together. She was 53 years old, a school vice principal, the kind of woman who kept a color-coded family calendar and never missed a parent-teacher conference. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and right now both of those things were pointed directly at Maggie. What did he do? To get in there? Fraud? Forgery? So he's a con man. He made mistakes. He's been working to Mom. Patty's voice was gentle but firm. The same voice she used with students who'd convinced themselves of something that wasn't true. Con men don't stop being con men because they're behind bars. They practice. Maggie felt the words land and felt herself reject them simultaneously, which was its own kind of warning that she chose not to examine. "You don't know him," she said. "Neither do you." The conversation ended without resolution, which was the Collins women's way of ending conversations that had hit bone. Patty left after 2 hours, having eaten dinner with forced normalcy, and kissed Maggie's cheek at the door, with a look that said everything she hadn't been able to make her mother hear. That night, Maggie called her son Daniel, in Seattle. She kept it brief and general, mentioned the Pen Pal program, mentioned that she'd found it meaningful. Daniel's response was quieter than Patty's, but carried the same undertone. "Just be careful, Mom," he said. "Please." "I'm 62 years old," she said. "I've been careful my whole life." She hung up and then sat with that sentence for a while. Because it was true, and because she wasn't entirely sure anymore whether she meant it as a reassurance or a complaint. February brought a letter that changed things. "I need to be honest with you," Robert wrote, "because you've been honest with me, and you deserve the same. What I feel when I read your letters is something I haven't felt in longer than I can remember. I know what the world would say about that, about a man in my situation, saying this to a woman like you. I know how it looks. But I'm not willing to be dishonest with you just to protect myself from how it looks. Maggie, I think about you every day." She read the letter standing at the mailbox, still in her garden gloves. Dirt on her hands and her heart going fast in a way she hadn't felt since she was young and certain about everything. She should have put it in the drawer and slept on it. She wrote back that same hour. By March, the letters had become something neither of them named, but both of them understood. His release date was 10 months away. He'd mentioned a halfway house in Augusta, the possibility of a fresh start, the things he dreamed about, a small apartment, a garden, mornings without counting them. She found herself thinking about what that might look like. She found herself thinking, and then she found herself hoping. And that was when the ground beneath her began, very quietly, to shift. Robert Harlan was released from Georgia State Prison on a Thursday morning in late November. 14 months after his first letter to Maggie. She knew the date because he'd told her. She knew the time, 9 a.m., which was when routine releases typically processed, because she'd looked it up. She did not go to Reidsville. She had wanted to. She had thought about it for weeks, had rehearsed the drive in her mind, had imagined standing in a parking lot with the gray morning around her, watching a man walk through a door and into the world and into something that felt like a beginning. She didn't go because Patty had found out she was considering it and had sat across from her at this same kitchen table and said, very quietly, "Mom, if you drive to that prison, I am coming with you, and I will not be quiet." And because Maggie loved her daughter and did not want a scene in a prison parking lot, she stayed home. But she waited by the phone. He called at 11:30. His voice, when she finally heard it, after 14 months of imagined voices, of filling in the sound from the shape of his words, was lower than she'd expected, measured, warm in a way that felt practiced without quite feeling false. "Maggie," he said. "I'm out," she cried. She hadn't anticipated that, and she pressed her hand over her mouth so he wouldn't hear. But he heard anyway and said, very softly, Hey, it's okay. I'm okay." They talked for 2 hours. He was at the halfway house in Augusta, which he described as clean enough and managed by people who didn't ask too many questions. He had a job lined up. He'd been vague about the details in his letters, mentioning a contact, a former associate who owed him a favor. He said he planned to get stable, get on his feet, and then he paused here, and the pause was loaded. They should meet, properly, in person. "I think so too," she said, and meant it completely. The visits began 6 weeks later. She drove to Augusta on a Saturday in January, chose a restaurant she'd found online, bright and public and unremarkable, and sat at a corner table 15 minutes early, with her hands folded and her heart conducting itself badly. He arrived 4 minutes late and was nothing like she'd feared and nothing like she'd entirely expected. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples and a face that had weathered its years without losing a certain kind of appeal. He walked toward her table with the careful confidence of a man who'd learned to take a room's measure before crossing it. And when he smiled, it was the smile from the letters considered real, directed entirely at her. They talked for 3 hours. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, which she recognized later was its own flag she had chosen not to read. He remembered every detail she'd ever shared in her letters, her garden, her book club, the magnolia tree, the scrambled eggs. He referenced them naturally, without effort, as though they'd become part of his own memory. She drove home in the dark, through the low country and the Spanish moss and the Georgia night, and thought, whatever this is, it is real. But the first cracks appeared within weeks. Small things. At first, he called sometimes at odd hours. Not worrying hours, but unexpected ones. And on 2 occasions, she heard voices in the background that he explained away quickly, smoothly, in a way that left no room for follow-up questions. He was vague about his job logistics, he said, when she pressed, and business consulting on another occasion, and the inconsistency was slight enough that she almost missed it. He asked her, on their 3rd in-person visit, about her finances, gently, casually, embedded in a larger conversation about retirement. He asked how she managed the house on her own, whether Frank had left things in order, whether she found it difficult navigating all of it solo. She'd answered honestly. Frank had been careful. She was comfortable but not extravagant. She managed fine. She didn't mention the $180,000 in her savings account. But afterward, she noticed she'd mentioned the house was paid off. That night, she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling fan and felt something she hadn't felt in all the months of letters and anticipation. A low, cold unease, like a draft from a door she couldn't locate. She called Patty in the morning. She didn't tell her about the financial question. She told her Robert was out, that they'd been meeting, that things were going well. Patty's response was careful, measured in the way she'd learned to be when she knew that pushing too hard would push her mother in the wrong direction. "Is he treating you well?" Patty asked. "Yes," Maggie said, and it was true, on the surface, in every way she could point to. "Mom." A pause. "Have you looked him up? Like, actually looked him up? Public records?" "He told me everything about his case." "He told you what he chose to tell you." After they hung up, Maggie sat with her laptop open for 20 minutes before she closed it again. The truth was, she was afraid of what she might find. And the fact that she was afraid was its own answer, though she wasn't ready yet to hear it. By February, Robert had asked her for money for the first time. He'd framed it carefully, as a loan, for an investment opportunity he described as time-sensitive and certain to yield returns. He was apologetic and clearly uncomfortable asking, or he performed apologetic and uncomfortable convincingly enough that she couldn't tell the difference. He mentioned repayment in specific terms. He mentioned interest. He mentioned how much it would mean to be able to show her, concretely, that he was building something real. She said she needed to think about it. That night, she finally opened her laptop. She didn't search his name first. She searched the halfway house in Augusta, verified it was real, which it was. She searched the name of the contact he'd mentioned his job connection, the former associate, and found nothing. Then she typed Robert Harlan Fraud Georgia into the search bar and pressed enter, and what came back was considerably more than a 7-year sentence for fraud and forgery. She read for 2 hours. She had to stop 3 times, go to the kitchen, get water, breathe. There had been previous convictions. A woman in Macon, 2008, a widow, 64 years old, who had lost $40,000 to a man matching Robert's description and his methods. The case had resulted in charges that were ultimately reduced on a technicality. There had been a civil suit, settled out of court, from a woman in Savannah, her city, Maggie's city, in 2014. The Georgia state prison sentence had been his 3rd. He had been doing this for 20 years. She sat at the kitchen table until midnight, and then she went to bed. And she stared at the ceiling, and she understood with a clarity that was cold and total and devastating. She had been chosen, not found. He had known from the program records that she was a widow in Savannah. The letters had been a roadmap, drawn by her own hand, of everything he needed to know to take from her. The mockingbird, the grief, Frank's eggs, the magnolia tree. She had given him every key. She had built the lock herself and handed him the combination. She did not call him the next morning. This was the first decision not to call, not to confront, not yet. She'd spent enough years watching crime procedurals with Frank to know that confrontation without preparation was a gift to the wrong person. She sat with her discovery for 24 hours, which was the hardest thing she'd done since she'd held Frank's hand in the hospital room and made herself let go. She called Patty on a Sunday morning before church. She told her everything, the letters, the visits, the financial question, what she'd found online. She did it without softening or omission, the way she'd never quite managed to talk about any of it before. And when she finished, there was a silence from Patty's end that was not the silence of judgment, but the silence of a daughter who loves her mother and is terrified. "Mom," Patty finally said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word. "I know," Maggie said. "I know. Have you given him any money?" "No, not yet," he asked. "I said I needed time." "Okay." Patty's voice shifted into the register Maggie recognized from childhood.com, decisive. The voice that meant, "I'm handling this. I'm coming over. Don't call him. Don't respond to anything. Just wait for me." Patty arrived within the hour, and she brought her husband, Tom, who was a retired Chatham County Sheriff's deputy and who, upon hearing the story, made several phone calls that Maggie was not entirely sure she wanted made but recognized as necessary. By Tuesday, they had spoken with a detective at the Savannah Police Department, a woman named Carmen Rodriguez, mid-40s, with a kind of precise and compassionate manner that suggested she'd had this particular conversation more than once. She pulled Robert Harlan's full record while Maggie sat across the desk and watched the detective's face remain professionally composed. "This individual has a documented pattern," Detective Rodriguez said, choosing her words carefully, targeting widowed or divorced women, typically in their late 50s to mid-60s, through programs designed to create trust. "He's sophisticated. He takes his time." She looked at Maggie directly. "You aren't the first, Mrs. Collins. And you almost certainly would not have been the last." "What can be done?" Tom asked. "He hasn't technically committed a crime yet," the detective said. "He's asked for money, and she hasn't given it. But if she's willing to work with us," Maggie looked at her daughter. Patty's face held a question she was waiting for her mother to answer. "What would that involve?" Maggie asked. "It involved a controlled encounter." Robert had been pushing for a visit to Savannah. He'd mentioned it twice, expressed a desire to see where she lived, to walk the streets she'd described in her letters. Detective Rodriguez's proposal was straightforward. Maggie would agree to the visit. She would record the conversation, working with a small device provided by the department. They needed him to make the financial ask again, on record, with specificity. They needed the paper trail they didn't yet have. Maggie drove home from the police station and sat in her car in the driveway for a long time. The magnolia tree was bare in the February cold, its branches articulate against the white sky. She thought about Robert's letter, the closest thing to peace I've found in here, and the way she'd read it 4 times, pressing it against something in herself that needed to believe it was true. She thought about the women in Macon and Savannah who'd come before her. She thought about Frank, who had believed in second chances, but who had also, she remembered now, believed fiercely in accountability. He'd said once, at dinner, over some news story or another, a second chance isn't a free, it's a chance to do better. Those are different things. She called Detective Rodriguez the following morning and said yes. Robert arrived in Savannah on a Saturday in late February. She met him at a cafe on Bratton Street, the kind of place with tall windows and exposed brick, and the smell of dark roast that she usually loved and could not taste today. He was charming from the moment he walked in, complimenting the city with the ease of a man performing touching her hand across the table in a way that 3 months ago would have moved her and now felt like a mechanism. He brought it up over dessert. The investment opportunity. He'd refined it since asking the first time, had details now, a contact name, a timeline, a return projection. He was specific in a way that sounded researched, and she understood that this was the script. That he had done this before, that she was hearing the version of it that had worked. She asked the right questions. She kept her voice steady. She had been coached, but she hadn't needed much coaching. Grief had taught her how to function through pain, how to keep her face composed while something inside her broke. He asked for $45,000. She said she'd think about it. Outside the cafe, in the cold, he hugged her and said he was grateful for her, and she stood very still inside the hug and breathed. And Detective Rodriguez, in a car across the street, was recording everything. He was taken into custody 3 days later at the Augusta halfway house. Maggie was at home when it happened. Tom called to tell her, and she thanked him and hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the morning quiet. And for the first time in weeks, she became aware of the ceiling fan, still turning its slow and lazy circles overhead. Spring came to Savannah the way it always did, not all at once, but in increments. The air softening degree by degree, the azaleas along Abercorn Street erupting in pink and white and magenta like something reckless and hopeful. The Spanish moss catching the new light differently than it did in winter. Maggie replanted her garden in March. She'd let it go over the winter, distracted and interior in a way she hadn't been, even in the worst months after Frank died. A different kind of grief, she supposed, for a different kind of loss. What you mourned when a loved one died was their presence. What you mourned when you'd been deceived was the parts of yourself you'd trusted and been wrong about. The two were not the same, but they occupied adjacent rooms. She started with the raised bed along the back fence. New soil, new seedlings, tomatoes, because Frank had loved them, and marigolds, because their color was unapologetic. She worked in the mornings when the air was still cool, and she thought about many things, and she let herself think about them without flinching. She thought about loneliness and what it could do to a person's judgment, how it didn't announce itself as vulnerability but dressed itself as readiness. She had thought she was ready, ready to feel something again, ready to let someone in, and she had been ready. She just hadn't been careful about where she walked with that readiness, what door she'd walked through. She did not absolve herself of the self-deception. She had seen the flags and looked past them. She had heard her daughter's voice and chosen the letters. She had known, in the way we always know the things we aren't willing to know, and she had chosen not to know. That part was hers, and she made herself hold it without cruelty, but without excuse either. Because one of the things Frank had understood about her was that she was most herself when she was honest. Patty came over most Saturdays now, not with the worried, careful energy of the past year, but something easier to women who had gotten through something together, had said the hard things and remained standing. They gardened side by side and argued about whether the tomatoes needed more sun, and Patty's boys came sometimes and made too much noise. And the house felt different in a way that was good. "Do you want to talk about it?" Patty asked one Saturday, the two of them sitting on the back porch with iced tea, the spring afternoon warm and generous around them. "I talk about it," Maggie said. "I've been talking about it." "No? I mean, do you want to talk about how it started? Why?" Maggie looked at her garden for a moment. "I was lonely," she said. "Not unhappy. Lonely. There's a difference, and I don't think I'd understood that about myself. Unhappy is something you fix by changing your situation. Lonely is something that sneaks up on you, even when your situation is good." She turned to look at her daughter. "I let that loneliness make decisions for me. He was very good at finding it." "He was," Patty said, "but you're the one who stopped it." That was true, and it mattered, and Maggie was working on letting it matter as much as the rest of it did. Robert Harlan's legal proceedings moved through the Georgia courts with the particular deliberate pace of the justice system. Detective Rodriguez called occasionally with updates. The fraud and forgery charges from the earlier sentence had complicated things favorably. The recorded conversation was strong evidence, and the women in Macon had agreed to provide a statement. His attorney was negotiating, which Rodriguez said was a good sign of how airtight the case was. Maggie had provided a full victim statement. She'd sat in a room and said out loud what had happened, all of it. From the first letter to the cafe on Bratton Street, and she'd done it with a kind of clarity that felt like its own kind of completion, not closure, exactly. She wasn't sure she believed in the clean package of closure anymore. But completion ended, the period placed. In April, she went back to St. John's. She hadn't been since the fall, had drifted from her Sunday routine in the discomfort of what the church's own program had inadvertently facilitated. Though she understood rationally that no program could anticipate every misuse, Father McCarthy greeted her with the warmth of someone who hadn't asked too many questions and wouldn't, which was its own kind of grace. She did not return to the Pen Pal program. She would not do that again. Not because she believed all incarcerated people were Robert Harlan, but because she understood now that she'd come to that program not as a giver, but as someone who needed to receive. And that had made her porous in ways she hadn't protected against. Maybe one day, when she was fuller, she would think about it. Daniel called from Seattle on a Sunday in May, and for the first time in a long time, the call lasted over an hour. He'd been carrying guilt, she realized, for being far away, for the Sunday calls that didn't reach far enough, for not coming back when things went sideways. She told him there was nothing to carry. "I want to visit," he said. "This summer. Me and Lee and the kids." "Yes," with a force that surprised them both. "Yes, please." She started a new book club, not the libraries, which she still attended, but a smaller one, for women who met in each other's kitchens on Thursday evenings and drank wine and talked about books and then talked about everything else. One of them was a widow. 2 were recently divorced. None of them were the kind of women who would call their situations tragic, because they were past the point where that word did anything useful. Brenda Walsh, the program coordinator, called in June, not about anything specific, just checking in. She'd heard peripherally what had happened and felt responsible in the way good-hearted people do. "It wasn't your fault," Maggie told her, "and I don't regret that I tried to do something kind. I just need to be smarter about how I carry that kindness." "How are you doing, truly?" Brenda asked. Maggie looked out the kitchen window at the garden, the tomatoes coming in strong, the marigolds blazing orange and gold in the summer sun. The second coffee cup was still in the cabinet. She was thinking about taking it down. Not because Frank deserved less, but because she deserved more. More room. More space for things that hadn't happened yet. "I'm doing," she said. "That's enough for right now. I'm doing." Robert Harlan pleaded guilty in August to charges of fraud, wire fraud, and attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person, the last charge. She noted, had required her to be officially classified as elderly, which she found absurd and briefly irritating. He received a 12-year sentence. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted the deliberate pattern, the multiple victims, the calculated exploitation of women in grief. She read the court summary twice. On the morning she read it, she walked to the mailbox, an old habit. She still did it first thing, and opened it to find a postcard from Daniel's family, sent from a vacation stop in Tennessee, with her youngest grandson's handwriting on the back. "Grandma, we are coming soon. The dog misses you. He was 8. His handwriting was large and slightly crooked, and absolutely genuine. She held the postcard in the morning air, the Savannah summer already warm and thick around her, the magnolia tree full and green, the azaleas resting between their seasons. She thought about Frank and about the scrambled eggs and about the 41 years and the second coffee cup. She thought about the letters in the drawer she had finally, last week, thrown away. She thought about what Patty had said on the porch. "You're the one who stopped it." There were things she hadn't gotten right. She would be honest about that, as long as honesty served something. There were questions she should have asked sooner. Flags she should have read rather than filed away. Versions of her own voice she should have listened to when they tried to speak. Being 62 and capable and experienced hadn't protected her from loneliness. And loneliness hadn't protected her from wanting. And wanting hadn't protected her from a man who studied want the way other men studied markets. But she had stopped it. She had been afraid, and she had looked anyway, and she had seen what was there. And she had made the harder choice, rather than the comfortable. She had sat in that cafe on Braddon Street, with her heart broken and her voice steady, and she had done what needed doing. That was hers too. Not just the mistakes. All of it was hers. She put the postcard on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the state of Georgia. A silly thing Patty had brought her years ago, and she went inside to make coffee. 1 cup. And then she thought about it, and she made 2. And she brought both to the back porch and sat in the morning with one in her hand and one on the table beside her, steaming in the warm Savannah air. Frank would have found the whole story infuriating. He would have sat at this same table and listened, and gone silent in the way he did when he was angry, and then said something that cut precisely to the center of it. But then, and this she knew as certainly as she knew anything, he would have said, "You did right in the end, Mag. That counts." She sipped her coffee. A mockingbird landed in the magnolia tree and began to sing not its own song, because mockingbirds never sang their own songs, but a bright and borrowed collection of everything it had heard, everything it had survived, everything it was still learning how to carry. She listened until it finished. Then she went inside to call her daughter.